At 4:00 a.m. on the 23rd of August, 1987, a 7-5 car Union Pacific freight train barreled through the pitch-black woods of Alexander, Arkansas. As the train rounded a curve, the crew spotted 2 teenage boys lying perfectly parallel across the tracks, motionless, partially covered by a tarp. The official police narrative and the deeply insulting conclusion of the state medical examiner was that one 6-year-old Don Henry and one 7-year-old Kevin Ives had simply smoked too much marijuana, fallen into a deep coma, and slept through the deafening roar of a 6,000-ton train. But they didn't fall asleep. They were hunted down, brutally murdered, and posed on those tracks to cover up a state-sanctioned nightmare. When independent autopsies proved the boys had been stabbed and bludgeoned before the train ever arrived, the state didn't look for the killers, they looked for ways to bury the evidence. Today, we are going to dismantle one of the most terrifying, blood-soaked cover-ups in modern history, expose the government officials who orchestrated it, and trace the blood from those rural tracks all the way to a massive, untouchable criminal syndicate operating right under the governor's nose. The nightmare begins with the sheer, physical impossibility of the crime scene. The train's engineer, Stephen Schroyer, and the conductor closely watched the tracks as the massive machine cut through the Arkansas night. The train's horn was blaring, a sound so loud it physically vibrates the earth beneath your feet. Yet, the 2 figures on the tracks didn't flinch. They didn't roll over. They didn't attempt to cover their ears. They lay perfectly still, side by side. Schroyer slammed on the emergency brakes, sparks raining into the dark as tons of steel locked up. But a freight train cannot stop on a dime. It takes over half a mile of agonizing, screeching metal to bring the beast to a halt. The crew watched in helpless horror as the train rolled over the boys. When local law enforcement arrived, the standard protocol for any fatal incident should have been immediately enacted. Secure the perimeter. Take photographs. Collect every microscopic fragment of evidence. Treat it as a homicide until proven otherwise. Instead, the Saline County Sheriff's Office treated the site like a minor traffic accident. There was no grid search. There was no lockdown of the surrounding woods. But there was something far more sinister. The train crew explicitly reported seeing a green tarp partially covering the boys' bodies before the impact. By the time the police wrapped up their astonishingly brief investigation, that tarp had vanished. It was never logged into evidence. It simply ceased to exist. But the vanishing tarp was only the first insult. The true profound failure of the system came courtesy of Dr. Fahmy Malak, the chief medical examiner for the state of Arkansas. When you lose a child in a violent, traumatic way, the only solace you have is that the state will use the full weight of modern science to find the truth. You trust the white coats. You trust the badge. Dr. Malak looked at the mutilated bodies of Don Henry and Kevin Ives, completely ignored the glaring defensive wounds, and declared their deaths accidental. His official ruling? Marijuana intoxication. According to Dr. Malak, these 2 athletic teenagers had smoked the equivalent of a few joints, which somehow induced a state of total unconsciousness so profound that the blast of a train horn, mere feet away, could not wake them. It was a medical impossibility. There is not a single documented case in the history of human medicine of marijuana causing a coma so deep it overrides the basic survival instinct to flee an oncoming train. Let that sink in. A state-appointed medical examiner went on the record, overriding the laws of pharmacology, to forcefully shut down a double homicide investigation, and the local police eagerly nodded along, closing the case. If Kevin and Don's parents had been easily intimidated, the story would have ended right there. 2 local kids written off as tragic, drug-addled statistics. But Larry and Linda Ives, and Curtis Henry, refused to let their sons' memories be mutilated by a corrupt bureaucrat. They knew their boys. They knew the ruling was a lie, and they were about to find out exactly how deep the rot went. The families pooled their resources, fought the state, and managed to get their sons' bodies exhumed for a second autopsy. They hired Dr. Joseph Burton, an esteemed medical examiner from Atlanta. What Dr. Burton found didn't just contradict the state of Arkansas, it exposed them. Kevin Ives had not died from the impact of the train. His skull showed clear, distinct fractures that were completely inconsistent with a train strike. He had been brutally bludgeoned with a blunt instrument, likely the butt of a rifle, prior to being placed on the tracks. Don Henry's body told an even more violent story. His shirt was unbuttoned, and he had a severe stab wound to the back. A clean, deep puncture that had nothing to do with the crushing force of a locomotive. The conclusion was undeniable. The train was not the murder weapon. The train was the cleanup crew. Someone had beaten Kevin and stabbed Don in the woods, dragged their bodies onto the tracks, draped a tarp over them to keep them in place, and waited for the 4 a.m. freight train to erase the evidence. This is the exact moment where the illusion of justice shatters. When an independent expert completely dismantles an official state narrative, the police are supposed to pivot. They are supposed to launch a massive homicide investigation, driven by the fury of realizing a killer is on the loose. Instead, the system closed ranks. The authorities in Saline County did not launch a manhunt. They launched a defense of Dr. Malak. The state rallied behind their corrupt medical examiner, attempting to discredit the independent findings. Why? Because admitting Dr. Malak was wrong about Kevin and Don meant admitting he might be wrong about dozens of other highly suspicious deaths in Arkansas. It meant opening a Pandora's box of systemic incompetence, or worse, active malicious cover-ups. This is where the outrage truly begins. We are no longer looking at a tragic mistake. We are looking at an institution actively fighting the families of murdered children to protect its own power. Faced with a brick wall of local law enforcement, the parents pushed for a grand jury. Enter Dan Harmon. Dan Harmon was a local prosecuting attorney who enthusiastically stepped forward to champion the family's cause. He looked the grieving parents in the eye and promised them he would tear the county apart to find out who killed their boys. He ran the grand jury investigation. He had complete access to the evidence, the witness lists, and the confidential tip lines. He positioned himself as the white knight in a county drowning in corruption. It was all a horrifying illusion. Dan Harmon was not there to solve the murders. He was there to control the fallout. To understand why a local prosecutor would infiltrate a double homicide investigation to sabotage it from the inside. In the late 1980s, Arkansas was not just a quiet southern state. It was a major logistical hub for one of the largest drug smuggling operations in the world. Just a short flight away in Mena, Arkansas, an operation heavily rumored to be tied to the CIA and the Contra rebels in Nicaragua was flying literal tons of cocaine into the state. This wasn't a street-level gang. This was a massive, multi-million-dollar syndicate moving narcotics and weapons, and they required local infrastructure to distribute the product. They required untouched drop zones. They required law enforcement to look the other way, and they required local fixers to ensure their operations ran smoothly. Saline County, where Kevin and Don were murdered, was a known drop zone. Multiple witnesses eventually came forward stating that on the night of August 23, Kevin and Don were out spotlighting in the woods, a common local activity of shining flashlights to hunt. Only, they didn't spot a deer. They stumbled onto a major drug drop. They saw police officers, men in uniform, overseeing the movement of narcotics. They saw the untouchables. And for that, they were hunted down in the dark, beaten, stabbed, and thrown onto the steel tracks. When you realize that the local authorities were likely on the payroll of a massive drug syndicate, the entire case suddenly makes terrifying sense. The missing Tarp, the refusal to secure the crime scene, Dr. Malak's medically absurd autopsy. It wasn't incompetence. It was a perfectly executed protocol. It was the system functioning exactly as it was designed, to protecting the elite and discarding the innocent. And then came the bloodbath. When the grand jury investigation began, under the watchful, treacherous eye of Prosecutor Dan Harmon, people started talking. Citizens of Saline County who knew what was happening in the woods, who had seen the drug drops, or who knew the men involved, began to whisper. The response was swift, brutal, and completely ignored by the state. A man named Keith Coney claimed he had information about the murders. Before he could testify, he died in a horrific motorcycle crash after allegedly being chased by an unmarked car. The police ruled it an accident. Keith McCaskill, another man who began talking about the drug rings and the boys on the tracks, predicted his own murder. He told his friends that the local authorities were going to kill him. Shortly after, he was found brutally stabbed to death. Gregory Collins, who was subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury, was found dead from a gunshot blast to the face. The police, the very institution that should have been protecting a grand jury witness, ruled it a suicide. A man named Richard Winter offered to trade information about the murders for leniency on a robbery charge. He was found dead in a swamp with a shotgun blast to his face. The list goes on. Witness after witness, informant after informant, turning up dead in utterly bizarre, hyper-violent circumstances, all of them connected to the tracks, the drugs, or the corrupt officials running the county. And in almost every single instance, local law enforcement rushed to the scene to declare the deaths, accidents, or suicides, actively refusing to connect the dots. It was a systematic slaughter designed to silence a county, and it worked. The grand jury, led by Dan Harmon, ultimately returned 0 indictments for the murders of Kevin Ives and Don Henry. They sealed the records. They patted the grieving parents on the back and essentially told them to go home. But the truth about Dan Harmon couldn't stay buried forever. Years later, the White Knight prosecutor who led the charge to find the boys' killers was arrested, federally indicted, and convicted for running a massive drug extortion ring out of his own office. The man investigating the drug-related murders of 2 teenagers was, in fact, a kingpin of the local drug trade himself. Let that sit in your mind. The parents of Kevin and Don handed the keys of the investigation over to the very cartel they were trying to expose. The system didn't just fail them, it mocked them. It put the wolf in charge of the sheep and watched them get devoured. To this day, nobody has been formally charged with the murders of Kevin Ives and Don Henry. The state of Arkansas successfully outweighed the outrage. Dr. Fahmy Malak, the medical examiner who started the cover-up with his insulting marijuana coma theory, was never prosecuted for his blatant falsification of records. He was quietly moved out of his position years later, his pension fully intact. The elite politicians who oversaw the state while millions of dollars of cocaine flooded through Mena, destroying communities and funding off-the-books wars, went on to enjoy incredible power and prestige on the national stage. The men who beat a 17-year-old boy's skull in, and the men who plunged a knife into a 16-year-old's back, are likely still walking free. They wake up in comfortable beds, they eat in nice restaurants, and they live their lives knowing that a badge and a bankroll are the only things you need to literally get away with murder. Kevin and Don were not just victims of violent men in the woods. They were victims of a justice system that views the lives of working-class kids as entirely disposable when they threaten the profit margins of the powerful. The Saline County Sheriff's Office, the state medical examiner, the local prosecutor, they built a fortress of lies around a double homicide, and the mortar they used was the blood of 2 innocent boys. If you thought the police in this town were irredeemably corrupt, wait until you hear how a billionaire family manipulated the press, the police, and the courts to turn a cold-blooded double homicide into a staged, theatrical suicide to protect a corporate empire. Click the video on your screen to see the billionaire murder illusion they tried to bury.